Thanks, everyone. So this is just a panel discussion, so an open discussion, kind of an open floor. I'll ask some questions, but if there's any questions coming from the audience, anything you want to ask, just come on up and we'll hand you a mic and you can ask the question. So you might have heard throughout the event about the special interest groups that the OpenAPI have. So we thought this is a good opportunity for us to give an update on what they are, make sure that there's awareness of how we're planning to evolve these things, and so everyone knows how to get involved. There'll be a QR code popping up on the screen every so often, which will take you to an information repository, again containing more information on all of the SIGs, and you'll see something similar out in the sponsor area as well. So we have Stu Waldron here, who's representing travel, Josh Ponelith representing overlays, Nick Dinney representing workflows, Ken Lane representing SLA and others, and Isabel Moni representing security. So how I'd like to start this, and I'm delighted that Isabel and Ken are here because you were both co-chairs at the time when the OpenAPI decided to introduce the special interest groups. So I'm just very curious, why did the OpenAPI make that decision, and what was the thought process at the time?
Yeah, I can definitely start that off. At the time we were co-chairs, and the concept of a special interest group had existed for a while. There was even some documentation on the GitHub repo, like how you should do it. But I kept having people come to me and ask me, so how do we move forward the spec in a specific way, whether it's for travel, whether it's for finance, a specific industry. And that was kind of adjacent from the technical developer community or the steering committee that's actually moving forward the spec. And I think a lot of people were going directly to the Thursday spec meeting and trying to get involved and feeling like their asks or their needs weren't necessarily part of that conversation. So for a specific vertical like finance or healthcare or travel has different needs and wants and asks than someone who's actually looking to move forward the spec in a specific way. But then some of the other SIGs had more alignment with the spec from a security standpoint. And so I put some time into kind of mapping out like what is a SIG, how do you set one up? There was a lot of concern. Oh, is it not working?
It's okay. Use your voice.
I'm loud.
You're loud.
Is this one working? Yeah, this one seems to be better. All right. And so I started putting more structure into it, like how do you submit a GitHub issue to start a SIG? How do they all work? And then several folks came to me and were saying, well, we're not even sure the SIG's a good idea. We're not even sure it's get off the ground, and wanted a more kind of loosey-goosey approach to doing the SIGs. And they wanted less structure and it to be less responsible. And so we just kind of let it go, opened up the gate, gave a little bit of structure and then opened up the gate. And we ended up with, and actually, because I'm representing the SLA, I actually used the work the SLA group had been doing for a number of years as kind of the baseline, at least for how I saw the special interest groups. But Isabel, go ahead and layer on your view of why the security came to be and why SIGs were necessary.
Yeah, so without maybe talking about security in particular, I think another key idea behind the SIGs really was to maybe have more specialized people in a specific area working on a topic, so that the people who are in the TSE, in the steering committee, well, they know a lot of stuff, they're extremely knowledgeable, they might be super knowledgeable in overlays or super knowledgeable in security. So have people that have a special interest in a special area, work on that, and then bring it back into the core specification was also one of the core ideas. Or bring requirements, if we're talking about, travel and healthcare or banking, it's going to be more around, I have some special requirements in terms of things that I want to express within with the specification, which are not covered today. It may just be something that sits on top. But that's the idea. The idea is really how do we leverage, I think, to the maximum the community and their knowledge of a specific area to then bring it back into the core spec or as an extension to the spec, right? So for the security is, in that sense, is a bit specific maybe, because what we are looking at right now is how do we, allow to extend, I would say, what the security section of the spec allows you to describe, to be more flexible and extensible. Because right now, for example, somebody says, hey, I have an API that requires a digital signature in order to consume that API. You have that more and more, like HMAC signatures. If you're in the banking or insurance industry, this is a trend also to add additional security layer. You cannot express that with OpenAPI today. Plus, there's like 3 different ways of bringing a signature into the thing. So we're more working on the framework to actually get that to happen. So we get into more details of that, right? But so there's 2 main things. I think the key message is an opportunity of the SIGs to bring your specific knowledge into a specific domain and steer the specification into a direction which is useful to you as an end user of it.
I'll layer on before I pass it on. Part of everyone's got their own mic now. I think we're all special, and so one of the I'll be very honest and transparent about my motivations of why I really was pushing forward the SIGs. Is I've long believed that a lot of these specs shouldn't live in the OpenAPI. They should be adjacent to the OpenAPI specification, and I even have my own specification called APIs JSON that I developed in 2014 that link and connect all these disparate specs together into kind of one index of a spec. And I feel like the SLA specifically shouldn't be in the OpenAPI specification. I personally feel it should live adjacent to it, or it should be a first-class extension of the specification. But then I also saw needs, like talking with Stu and travel and in the healthcare, that not all the specs needed to change the OAS. They needed marketing connections. They need to be part of the APIs, this conference. And so we needed SIGs to not just drive forward the spec, but to drive forward marketing initiatives and others. So I had a multi-pronged approach. Yes, I want security to move forward in tandem, but I also wanted these other specs to move forward on their own, but under the umbrella of the API specifications conference. And full context, in that moment when I helped create the SIGs, I was also trying to put JSON schema and async API into the OpenAPI initiative, and I was unsuccessful in doing so, but they're both in the Linux Foundation now. So I still accomplished that goal, and I think that was successful. But I believe that the OAS or OAI should become an umbrella organization to these extensions, these other specs that may or may not affect the core. But SLA lives there, but I think workflow is an interesting one like that, because it could be across potential specs, right?
Yeah, so the workflows came out of, the pain point we had was you look at your OpenAPI spec and you've got all these endpoints, but what do you do first? How do you make the API calls? How do you actually use the API? And often there's a parameter in the path, but how do you get that parameter? Where's that ID coming from? So yeah, we wanted a way to specify a sequence of API calls and how they're related to each other. There was a bit more than links or anything that was currently in the spec, and just provide that more context to the spec. And so, yeah, that could work with, there are security scenarios there could be a webhook triggered, if you're trying to, you can't actually sort of define the full OAuth flow of signing in as a user really in one OpenAPI spec, especially with browser redirects and things like that don't make sense. But you could specify the scenario of, this is triggered by a webhook, and then you call these other things, and your auth service is not necessarily the same service as you're documenting in one OpenAPI spec. So bringing everything together and sort of giving that sort of real world example of how do you use this API was the pain point we're trying to get to.
So where's the workflow work at right now? What's on the horizon?
Well, apart from summer happening and not a lot happened in any of the SIGs, we have I think the main things that are stopping us just releasing a spec right now is we're still sort of talking about what's the nomenclature, what words should we use, which keywords are already used elsewhere, which we don't want to confuse people with. So, but that is, that's just a few meetings away from, we'll make a decision. We want more feedback, and we want to then present to the main TSC so we can get a bit more feedback. And then the other issue is sort of defining how do we define, this variable comes from here. And I've been interested in the overlay SIG because they have a similar problem of specifying into JSON schema or any JSON really, that aspect. So we didn't want to do something that was confusing and work differently. But we're otherwise, I think we know what we want to do we've sort of narrowed it down at least.
Yeah, I think scope is one of the challenges for workflows. So there's a lot of rabbit holes that we could go down that probably won't make us be successful or won't add any value to consumers. And that was one of the important points from the last panel. And workflows is really pivoting around that consumer experience. So you hand teams a single large API specification or maybe multiple, because achieving an actual outcome might involve multiple APIs. Maybe not even all of them are going to be defined using an OpenAPI definition. So that's one of the things that we're remaining open to that real world situation and just trying to analyze what actual use cases make sense, how deep to go down, being able to kind of explain all permutations of what you do to actually sequentially execute something, versus should we remain a little bit more on the happy path just to make sure that we negate the need for all out-of-band additional documentation that we know accompanies many API onboardings right now. And that's something that if we can do this in a way that's relatively subtle, but it's in a way that's also kind of assertable, it makes sure that we can protect those consumer-driven outcomes, and it will just help also mature any API moving forward, because you can always honor those kind of promises that you've made and those functional outcomes that you've made towards the consumers. So I think maybe now we'll run through some of the other ones.
Yeah.
Josh.
So on the overlays side, and I think Ken and the folks on the keynote really brought this to the forefront, where OpenAPI can be a platform, right? We're talking about an API, we're talking about specifics, but it can also be very overloaded, right? So we have a lot of information that we can start throwing into this document. And as someone who builds browser tools, I get scared, right? The browser can only handle so much. And so the overlays spec was an exploration into how can we extract some of this information and put it adjacent to the OpenAPI. And so the idea is you have this separate document that overlays your base document, adding in that information. And that opens up some doors. So where we can think of it as simply, well, we had one file and now we have 5 files, hoop-de-doo. But we can also think of variations of an OpenAPI file. So one of the primary use cases driving it was documentation and internationalization. So if you think of a translated OpenAPI file, the API itself is going to remain the same, but you want multiple versions of that file. And so you can describe each of those versions as an overlay document.
With no need to copy-paste.
With no need to copy-paste. So that's one of the charms, right? And we, on the overlay spec, because there were so many different use cases that we were looking into, we kind of got stuck in a bit of analysis paralysis. And so to get to, it's fun to talk about stuff, but it can be hard to actually, let's put some rubber on the road and let's get this into people's hands. And I think, coming up to where we are in the overlay spec is, the spec is good enough to start. And so what we're doing now is we're looking at ways to get this into prototype, into people's hands, that they can actually show us how wrong we were in the direction we were going with the overlays, what the nuances really need to be, and not what we were thinking about that they could be. And after that period, we can really put that 1.0 version on it, or maybe another version on it, and start to adopt it and push for that adoption.
It's an important spec. It's important work. We're going to need it.
Right, and we want to do it right. But we also don't want to get stuck in this whole mindset of, oh my goodness, have we considered this edge case? What about those things? And so,
MVP. You have an MVP now.
right, always MVP, right?
Okay. Stu.
On the travel side, I remember where this conversation started. It was Ken, driving this, and I was already running and still running another standards group called the Open Travel Alliance. Ken and I got together, and I remember the conversation a bit more than a year and a half ago because I was on a cross-country motorcycle trip, and remember sitting talking to Ken through the Bluetooth of my helmet under a tree in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. I wasn't actually really sure where I was, but Ken conveyed what he wanted to do and said, let's give it a try. And so what we're doing as an industry SIG, it's a little longer term focus. And what we're doing is partnering with all the other SIGs to go ahead and bring information. In this case, what does a particular industry need? What's its challenges? Where's the bang for the buck? Because this is also all our talk about how do we demonstrate relevancy to the people that are actually working with APIs. And as I did in my pitch, there's a big challenge for the number of APIs out there and how they act. So, we've worked out kind of like what is the purview of the travel SIG, what goes back to open travel. So we kind of have multiple ways to push information out depending on what's appropriate. We also then got together as a group, and we have Delta on this and Hilton on this and Oracle, who does a property management system on this, and I'm getting more people joining in. And we talked about the more egregious problems in travel, and because of the workflow work, that's a big problem in the industry. So many APIs published, so many people have to use trial and error to figure out what the hell do you do, through the shop book, pay ticket type of flow. So we're looking at it and providing input to the workflow. I've done some also with the overlays, but also in the meantime, looking at what can we do right now? What can we get out in the next 6 months that would actually be looked at as value by this industry? And so it's a target-rich environment for the number of issues the industry has with APIs, but we're trying again to get to something that we have help with solving the problem, can get it back out there and show we're making a difference to the industry, and then we'll go on and hit the next problem and the next problem. But look at it as this is a way the industry SIGs under what Ken thought up is it's a two-way street. There's real-world information, everything coming in on how the specs or other types of documentation can make a difference, and a flow out now with an industry focus to go around to the travel companies that we have contact to say, this is what's happening here that's now actually relevant to what you're doing and what your business is. So far, so good.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of an onus on all of us in the vendor space as well to make sure that we can get this out into the hands of the wider community to provide feedback, because talking about it, as Josh said, from a pure technical specification perspective doesn't help getting real feedback. So the sooner we can kind of commit to getting rough edge prototypes out there, there's, non-committal, but at least enough to get feedback, I think the faster we'll accelerate across all of the different SIGs.
And I guess this is like a common thing across all at least the technical SIGs, I would say, right? It is that we're at a point where there's some kind of proposal which has been put in place from our own knowledge and experience, and where I think, you can be involved is really in bringing more of those use cases to validate our thinking, I would say, right? So it's true of security, it's true of workflows, it's true of overlays. The more real use case and real life, information and use cases we get, the better we can define that 80-20, I guess, use cases and go forward, right? That's pretty much where we are, right?
This is all a bit early on as to document the use cases.
Yeah.
We spent a while just figuring out how can we do that and work with other teams? But that's still kind of a green field about what is the best way, in a more consistent way, can we document the user stories and use cases in order to share around? So this is all still a bit new to some extent. There's still some things we're working out.
Well, and I think the SLA is the more mature example of this need, though, is the SLA, if you haven't been following, it's been going on for quite a long time, number of years, and it's fully baked from an academic standpoint. I would say more so than the workflows, the overlay, or the security. And it handles all what you need for a service level agreement. What's lacking now is those actual use cases, those actual implementations, getting it out of academia and actually applying, the real world expertise and knowledge and use cases and how business is going to do it. I know Adil has this experience with the SDK realm, is literally has this PhD in doing SDKs and how interoperability. But until you actually get out in the world doing this and actually seeing what customer needs and hammering on and finding those use cases, we're not going to get that next round. And that's what I think the SIGs are for, is moving forward the technical details of each one, but it's the wider vehicle, the use cases, getting tooling and providers involved.
I mean, speaking earlier to like why the SIG started, I think that initial step of giving a voice for something very specific has been achieved, right? So there is, I think a lot of these specs are good enough that there's real value in there. And now the next level is what we're looking at. So, in terms of that initial thought, how can we put a focus on something that there is a core group that is very interested in this area? And that's achieved. So that's awesome. And now our next problem is, all right, how can we get this value out there? How can we really share, the thought that's gone into it?
Is that a good time to pause maybe for some questions? Anybody has?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
2 questions. One, how did you decide what topics were going to be SIGs? That's the first thing. Like, how did you know it needed to be overlay or workflow? And 2, how does somebody who has a business problem need a SIG that's none of you guys? Like, how do you create that?
I'll repeat that just because you don't have a microphone. So like, how did we get started with the ideas? How do we come up with that set of SIGs right now? And pretty much how do I start a new one, right? Pretty much is what you're asking for. How did we start? Well, it's kind of pretty natural, right?
It was pretty organic.
Yeah, it was organic. I think the security one, because we had a problem. I think all of us had a problem to fix, and we just needed an avenue and a channel to actually work on that specific problem. That's pretty much where the different topics came from. I think the overlays is also because this is something that MuleSoft had been working on. With RAML, etc. The workflows is because of you guys. So yeah.
I think the point is it's not a closed club. Please join the SIGs. Help us.
Yeah, every SIG is looking for additional input, additional support. With regards to creating new ones, the QR code will bring you to a place where we can put together some initial kind of process on if you wanted to propose a new SIG and get started. Here's kind of the guide to do that. So that information is there. We're happy to accept feedback on that as well. Is it clear? Is it concise? Are there gaps? So everyone feel encouraged and welcome to submit feedback on that. Again, it's our first pass, and it's not going to get better until we get feedback.
So, I mean, the requirements for entry are you're a live human being breathing and you're passionate about something. That's pretty much like the low bar in the OAI. Like, we need your energy and passion to step up and do this. I would point out there's another SIG that's not represented here, finance. And then there's a need for healthcare. So those are the I would say finance, healthcare, and travel and hospitality are like the 3 top industries ones. But then overlays, workflows, service level agreement, and security are the other top ones. But I think overlays has a potential for spinning out other kind of SIGs and extensions.
SIG for SIGs?
Yeah, SIG for SIGs is basically, I mean, because like change management, should that be an overlay? Should it be its own spec? I think it could be the SIG for SIGs.
And the life cycle SIG, which also isn't represented here, and it's also quite nascent. But again, that elevates everything over beyond OpenAPI, and it's kind of that maturity curve where there can be value here in defining the life cycle of an API agnostic of the specification that is used to describe that particular API, because you effectively go through the same process, the same people challenges, the same business challenges. So there's no reason why it's isolated to a specific specification language.
Who else raised their hands? Somebody. Brenda.
I'll just shout really loud. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So I have a question for the folks who are not the industry SIGs. As you're defining the adjacent specs, is there also some thought about tooling? How will people actually use those specs in their lifecycle?
So just repeat for everyone's, like as we work on those technical extensions, is there a thought also about tooling around those? If you guys are.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So there's a lot of alternatives to how you can compose a YAML file together. And one of the key drivers around overlays is to make it accessible to tooling, to reduce the amount of magic and the amount of processing power you need and incidental complexity. Right, so we want to keep it YAML, we want to keep it simple, and we want to make that a first-class citizen in your YAML portfolio. I think is spec YAML is almost becoming synonymous, at least in this audience. And so definitely, right, tooling is vital from my point of view, and I think from the folks on overlays, and I imagine workflows is similar there too. Right? I think they're a little more intent heavy, like what is the intent of this as a communication platform? And then, tooling would be secondary to that because that's just huge value on its own. Whereas overlays is more tooling heavy. The intent can already be communicated, but how can we recompose this? How can we, separate these concerns out? So hopefully that answers.
For workflows and tooling, I mean, API metrics, we make API calls in a sequence, so somewhat invested in that. And we could just define whatever we do and ignore OpenAPI if we wanted, but no, we want to have a common standard because we actually want people to have open APIs and define these sequences so we can read documentation and understand how the APIs work ourselves. So it's kind of we're building it hopefully so people will come in some ways for workflows, but we also want to use it. So it's both ways it works.
I would answer this question from two kind of side dimensions. Is one, tooling is super critical to the spec itself, and there's a lot of work to be done there as far as how we harden and move forward the spec and get tooling providers involved. So that's a big piece of it, SIGs aside. But the other, what we mentioned, and I talked about a little bit in the previous panel, is extensions. What is the relationship between extensions and SIGs? And the SLA is an extension right now. And I personally don't, as I said before, I don't feel like it should be in the spec, but we should elevate and have first-class kind of citizens as extensions. And then back to bring it home to the tooling is, when you start spidering and looking for harvesting the extensions that are in use out there, you see how tooling providers are extending the spec, and you see we should have a gateway SIG, we should have a code gen SIG, you start seeing the SIGs come to life in the shadows of the tooling that are doing things with the spec. So I think the relationship between extensions and the SIGs, and then the Venn diagram with the industries is a pretty important one we need to watch and think about. But tooling is a deficiency, something we need to invest in heavily as an org going forward, aside from the SIGs.
Great. Okay, so I want to wrap up in like 1 minute so everyone can go to the other breakout sessions that are happening. But in 1 or 2 words, if you could achieve something in the next 6 months with each of your SIGs, what would you like that to be? So starting with you, Isabel.
Basically get validation of the proposal we have for the new credentials format and how to apply them. That's it.
Great.
Adoption and feedback loops.
Yeah, first draft out and all the above.
Part of a CI/CD pipeline, like first tooling use case.
Documentation, information update out to the travel industry about this work and what it's relevant to them, and in some cases, and what should they do right now that keeps them going in the right direction as the specs mature.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So QR code there, also out in the sponsor lobby, so that will bring you to where there's more information and how you can get involved and help us all out. We need your help. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.